Before the stars were numbered and before covenants were spoken from heaven, there was a night so violent that even angels turned their faces away. That night, the man who would one day be called Father of Faith tasted the kind of guilt that could rot a man's soul. And for years after it, God said nothing. Not a whisper. Not a sign. Only silence. This is the story the scrolls never dared to speak. This is the shadow of Abraham, before he became Abraham. When he was still Abram, a wanderer with fire in his bones and blood on his hands. They say purpose is born in pain, but what if pain comes first as punishment? Abram had not yet heard the voice of the Lord, but he had seen omens. Nightmares that clawed into his chest like wolves. Burning deserts that swallowed men whole. And one man, in particular, who stood in his way. A cruel merchant named Dagon, who ruled the trade routes with an iron grip and defiled everything he touched. Dagon had once offered Abram's wife to passing soldiers in exchange for gold. That was the beginning of something dark. Something that would not end with words. That night, Abram walked alone beneath a black sky. No stars. No wind. The silence felt like judgment. His robes clung to his sweat-drenched body as he neared Dagon's tent on the edge of the hill. There was no plan, only rage. His hand shook around the dagger wrapped in goat leather. Not for war. Not for justice. This was not sacrifice. This was vengeance. And deep within his chest, a voice he could not name whispered, "Do it." Was it his own voice? Was it a demon? Or something darker still, like the silence before a storm from heaven? Dagon slept with his guards drunk outside, sprawled in wine-soaked sand. Abram stepped past them like a ghost. The dagger pulsed in his hand, heavier than a sword, though it was barely the length of a hand's span. He opened the tent slowly. The air inside smelled of incense and rotting skins. Dagon snored beneath layers of wool. Abram paused. His eyes stung. Something in him hoped the man would wake. That he would see him. Fight him. Give him a reason to stop. But Dagon didn't move. So Abram did. One stab. Then another. And one more, for the memory. When it was done, Abram sat beside the corpse for hours. Not in triumph. Not in grief. Just silence. The same silence that filled the heavens. The kind that suffocates prophets before the word comes. Blood dripped from his fingers like cursed oil. He expected thunder. Wrath. A whirlwind. But nothing came. The stars returned overhead, blinking without judgment. Somewhere, a jackal howled. But heaven did not speak. He waited for a sign. A tremor in the earth. A shadow. A rebuke. But none came. And that terrified him more than punishment. Because even hell makes noise. Only God stays quiet. He buried the body in dry soil, far from the caravan path. Each handful of earth felt like a confession. But the land refused to drink the blood. It sat there, thick and gleaming, as if rejecting the offering. By morning, the wind returned. His clothes flapped violently as if to tear him apart. His wife, Sarai, never asked where he had gone. But her eyes held a distance that made the air colder. She smelled the blood, even beneath the washing. And every night after, she lay beside him like one lays beside a stranger, with silence as the blanket. Years passed. Cities were built. Kingdoms fell. But heaven said nothing. Abram prospered in silver and cattle, but every blessing felt poisoned. He built altars, but fire never fell. He offered sacrifices, but smoke rose without answer. His herds grew, yet his nights shrank into whispers. He began to fear sleep. Dreams came in waves, visions of sand turning to blood, of a voice calling his name but never reaching his ears. It was as if God hovered nearby, watching, waiting, but refusing to come close. Until one night, under the terebinth tree, a tremor passed through his bones. Something was finally shifting. That tremor wasn't wind. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The kind that happens when the soul senses it's being weighed, measured, judged. Abram rose from the tent, barefoot, walking toward the horizon like a man hypnotized. His camels stirred nervously. Owls fled from unseen shadows. He stood at the edge of the ridge and stared into the desert void. And then, in the distance, he saw a figure. Still. Watching. Cloaked in white, face hidden in moonlight. It made no sound. No gesture. But Abram knew. This was not man. Nor beast. This was presence. And still, heaven said nothing. In that moment, Abram's knees buckled. The wind howled louder, yet the figure did not move. The silence now screamed. 1,000 memories rushed back, the blood, the dagger, the soulless eyes of Dagon. Abram wanted to fall, to beg, to scream into the sky. Why won't you speak? But no words came. The figure began to fade, dissolving into light and shadow, like a mirage of judgment. Abram remained on the ground until dawn, his face in the dust, trembling. And when he finally stood, his hands were shaking again. Just like they did the night he became a killer. The drought followed him. Wherever he journeyed, rain fled. Grass withered. Wells grew shallow. Yet people called him blessed. They saw his cattle, his tents, his warriors, his gold. They did not see the weight behind his eyes. The shame that aged his face faster than time. Even Sarai no longer spoke his name with softness. The silence had infected everything. Even laughter died in their camp. And still, God said nothing. That silence became louder than thunder. Louder than judgment. Because silence, when worn too long, becomes a second skin. And Abram wore it like armor he could never remove. In the 6th year after Dagon's death, Abram saw something impossible. A small girl, no older than 10, appeared at the edge of his camp. Alone. Dusty. Eyes pale as snow. No tribe claimed her. No footprints led to her arrival. She held a bird in her hands, dead, but not decayed. She looked at Abram and whispered words he couldn't hear. Then she vanished. Just vanished. No wind. No shadow. Just gone. That night, Abram dreamt of fire swallowing the sky. And in the flames he saw Dagon's face, smiling. Smiling like a god who had won. The silence was cracking. He began walking at night. Alone. Searching for signs. For visions. For punishment. Something. Anything. He wandered deep into the desert, hoping to be devoured. But the scorpions spared him. The wolves kept their distance. Even death rejected him. It was then he realized something horrifying. God wasn't punishing him. God was withholding himself. Like a father who refuses to look at his son. Abram began to believe he was cursed. Not with wrath, but with absence. And that is the cruelest judgment of all. Not fire. Not flood. But indifference. As if heaven had erased his name from its own memory. One night, Abram found an ancient ruin buried in the sand. Broken pillars. Cracked altars. Symbols older than memory. He entered the circle of stones, and for the first time in years, felt, watched. Not judged. Not loved. Just observed. Like prey. A serpent crawled across the altar, then stopped. Its eyes locked onto Abram's. And it spoke without speaking. You killed one of mine. He fled the ruin, but the words followed him in dreams. The desert was no longer silent. Now it hissed. And he wondered, was Dagon not just a man? Was he something older? Something hell had marked? Back at the camp, Sarai miscarried. Her screams echoed through the hills. The blood soaked the tent floors like a second curse. Abram held her hand as life slipped from the child before it was ever born. He wept for a son he never met. And beneath the sobs, the silence returned. Sarai didn't blame him, but her eyes did. In that moment, Abram remembered a verse he had once heard whispered among nomads. The earth remembers blood, even when heaven forgets. And he feared that Dagon's death had not ended anything. It had only awakened something deeper. Something ancient. He began building again. Not tents, but altars. Crude, desperate, broken altars. Stones stacked without order, fireless. But this time, he didn't ask for blessing. He begged for wrath. He wanted God's fury. Wanted to be destroyed. But nothing came. He screamed into the skies until his throat cracked. He bled onto the stones. And still, silence. No angel. No dream. No thunder. Just the sound of flies, and the distant wail of a mourning woman in another tent. Abram began to realize something devastating. Maybe forgiveness would never come, because maybe the silence was the forgiveness. And that terrified him even more. On the seventh night after the miscarriage, Abram saw a burning tree. Not consumed. Not touched by wind. Just burning. Alone in the valley. He approached it slowly. His shadow danced across the ground like a specter. And then, just beneath the crackling flames, he heard it, a heartbeat. Not his. Not Sarai's. A rhythm. Holy. Ancient. Terrifying. He fell to his knees. And then, it stopped. The tree went cold. The light vanished. The heartbeat faded. And once again, silence. That night, Abram did not sleep. He sat beneath the stars, whispering one question: what am I now? A prophet? Or a murderer? He began seeing marks in the sand, symbols. Circles within circles. Spirals like eyes. No one else saw them. Not even his servants. But every time he looked away and back again, they vanished. A voice began to hum in his skull. Not words. Just tones. Dissonant. Distant. He started hearing footsteps behind him. Breaths in empty rooms. The silence was no longer empty. It was inhabited. But by what, he could not say. All he knew was this: something had begun watching him the night he killed Dagon. And that something was patient. Very patient. Watching. Waiting. Feeding on the silence. And then, one night, he woke up screaming. Sarai ran in, but there were no wounds. No thieves. Just sweat and shadows. Abram looked at his hands. They were glowing. Not with fire, but with memory. The blood returned. Dagon's face returned. The dagger in his hand returned. He clawed at his own skin, trying to erase it. But it would not leave. He wept like a child. That was the moment the wind outside changed direction. A storm was rising. Heaven was moving. But not to speak. Not yet. First, it had to tear something down. Because not all silence is stillness. In the distance, a pillar of smoke began rising. Not from his camp. Not from any town. From nowhere. As if the earth itself had exhaled. The servants gathered, frightened. Animals wailed. Abram stood, his cloak flapping violently. And then, just as suddenly, the smoke twisted into a shape, a man. A burning man, standing in the cloud. No face. No form. Just flame. Watching. And just as quickly, gone. Abram fell to the ground, mouth open, whispering prayers he didn't remember learning. Because now he knew something terrifying. Heaven hadn't forgotten him. It had been preparing him. For something he wouldn't survive. And so ends the first shadow in the life of Abraham. Not as a hero. Not as a saint. But as a man who killed in silence, and was answered with silence. But silence is never empty. Sometimes it's the breath before thunder. The stillness before a name is spoken. The waiting before a soul is split in two. And as the stars began to fall that night, Abram looked up and whispered, "Speak, Lord." And from the heavens, only wind. But something unseen was beginning to stir. Because when God finally speaks to a man who's tasted guilt, the world shakes. There are moments in life when the soul stops asking why, and begins asking what next. But for Abram, the questions blurred. The sky no longer held answers. The stars, once countless, now looked like tiny judgment eyes. He woke daily with the ache of survival and the chill of something unfinished. He still built altars, but with hands that feared divine rejection. And every stone felt heavier. Every prayer felt hollow. His soul, once fierce and proud, now moved like a wounded animal, quiet, suspicious, never resting. He no longer feared death. He feared being seen. Truly seen. And found unworthy. Then came the tremor again. Not in the ground. In the air. Like a vibration under his skin. That same invisible pulse he had felt before visions appeared. The animals sensed it. They backed away from him. His servants whispered. Sarai wept without words. He stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley, clutching a staff not for support, but for defense against something unseen. Behind him, the camp grew cold. Fires refused to light. Wells tasted like ash. Something was near. Not judgment. Not forgiveness. But reckoning. The kind that makes a man's past stand up and walk toward him. In a dream that felt more real than waking, Abram was led into a vast field of bones. Sunless sky. Windless air. The bones stretched for miles, human, beast, and something else. In the center stood a table. Upon it, his dagger. Clean. Polished. Waiting. He tried to speak, but his mouth was sealed. A shadow appeared behind the table, tall and veiled in feathers made of smoke. It lifted its hand, not in wrath, but in permission. Abram understood. This wasn't punishment. This was a mirror. His past had arrived. And it would not let him move forward until he bled truth. He awoke gasping, the taste of dust in his mouth. The fire pit beside him had burned out, though no wind blew. Around the camp, nothing stirred. No birds. No insects. Even time seemed frozen. He sat up, his hands trembling. Then, just beside him, he saw it, a ram's skull. Clean. Untouched. Where no animal had died. Its horns curled into the symbol he had seen in his dreams, circles within circles. He reached for it, and it crumbled to ash. That night, he marked the spot with stones. Not to remember the dream, but to warn the earth, something is watching. The next morning, 3 strangers walked into his camp. They bore no dust. No fatigue. They walked as if gravity did not touch them. His servants tried to speak to them, but no words passed. The strangers didn't blink. Didn't sweat. They simply stood, waiting for Abram. When he stepped out, the wind shifted. And one of the strangers held out a small scroll. No seal. No words. Just the scroll. Abram took it with both hands, and the moment he touched it, the strangers vanished. Not into the distance, but into light. That night, he opened the scroll. It was blank. He stared at the empty parchment until dawn. Not a symbol. Not a smudge. Just pure white space. But his eyes refused to leave it. Because something beneath the blankness pulsed. Not visibly. Spiritually. And slowly, painfully, he began to understand. This was the answer. Not silence. Not rebuke. Blankness. God was not ignoring him. God had given him a void. A space. Not to be punished. But to decide. To act. To write. He had begged for direction. Instead, he was handed a page. Heaven had returned, but not with answers. With a terrifying invitation, now show me who you are. 4 days Abram didn't eat. Didn't speak. He wandered the desert with the scroll wrapped in cloth. Everywhere he went, the earth responded. Trees leaned. Winds twisted. Animals approached, then fled. He felt naked beneath the heavens. Like a man on trial whose judge said nothing, just waited. The silence had changed. It wasn't punishment. It was potential. But that made it worse. Because if he failed now, it would not be from ignorance. It would be by choice. And choice is the heaviest burden for a soul that still carries blood on its hands. He began building again. But this time, not altars of stone. He carved a space in the desert. A circle. Wide. Empty. meant not for God, but for himself. A place where he could face what he had become. For 3 nights he sat in the center of the circle, writing on the scroll. Not with ink, but with ash. The ash of old altars. The ash of dead things. He drew symbols. Lines. Fractures. Maps of pain. He didn't know what they meant. But his hands did. They moved with knowledge he didn't understand. Until the scroll was full. And it began to burn. The scroll ignited with no fire. It consumed itself in silence. And when the flames vanished, the ash remained in the shape of his own face. Not his physical face, but something deeper. His guilt. His past. His hidden rage. And in that ash image he saw a flicker, like breath. A heartbeat in the dust. And then, behind him, a whisper. Now I see you. He turned, but no one stood there. Only the desert. Empty again. But not blank. Not anymore. Heaven had seen him. And he had survived it. But with that sight came a cost. Now he must be tested. The next morning, Sarai was smiling. It was the first time in years. Her skin glowed. Her eyes danced. She placed his hand on her stomach. A flutter. A spark. A new heartbeat. Life had returned. But Abram's heart did not leap. It shuddered. Because he knew this joy was not free. It was the setup before the test. A gift offered before a greater demand. That night, he looked at the stars and felt them staring back. The silence was gone. But what replaced it was worse: expectation. And expectation, when divine, crushes every piece of a man not forged in truth. He dreamt of rivers. Blood rivers. Flowing uphill. And in the center, Dagon's face again. But this time, it was laughing with him. Not mocking. Not angry. As if both murderer and victim now shared the same seat in heaven's theater. Abram awoke with a scream in his throat but didn't let it out. Instead, he stood. Walked into the desert. Dug his hands into the sand and screamed into the ground. No voice answered. But a single worm crawled out and looked at him, then burrowed back down. Even the lowest of creatures had places to hide. But not him. Not anymore. Then the sky changed. Not in color, but in behavior. Clouds stopped drifting. Stars froze. The sun lingered too long before setting. Time became thick. Heavy. And into that thickened world, a voice finally came. Not loud. Not soft. Just final. It entered not through ears, but through bones. Walk before me, and be blameless. That was it. No comfort. No explanation. Just command. And Abram knew what it meant. The past could no longer shape his steps. Only the present could redeem them. But how do you walk upright when your soul still limps from the murder no one saw? He shaved his head. Removed his robes. Covered himself in dust. Not for grief, but for clarity. His servants feared him. Sarai watched him with reverence and distance. He began to speak less. Listen more. The silence had trained him. It had unmade him. And now, with every breath, he waited for the next instruction. But heaven does not raise soldiers. It raises witnesses. And Abram had seen too much to be the same. The man who had once killed in rage now walked with the burden of restraint. Because true transformation is not the absence of sin, it's the refusal to repeat it. Years passed again. Slowly. Like sand dripping through a broken hourglass. Sarai grew round with child. The camp buzzed with anticipation. But Abram stayed quiet. He felt the shift in heaven. Felt the countdown. God had not spoken again. Because once heaven speaks clearly, the rest is up to you. And obedience, Abram now knew, was not a feeling. It was a knife. A severing. A constant choosing of death over comfort. The stars that once mocked him now seemed to bow. And he understood, silence had never been punishment. It had been preparation. For the moment when the knife would return.